Hello, everybody. This is Dr. Rukas again. And today I'm actually going to do our first lecture, which is going to examine the article that you've been given as part of your reading assignments, and primarily the works of William Julius Wilson. And what we're looking at right now is where are we, and that's actually going to be more toward the end of this lecture, but primarily from a Wilson point of view is how did we get here, all right? There's a very intriguing argument that is made, and that is that the current state of impoverished African American neighborhoods is largely a vestige of slavery. While slavery is no longer an issue, the root of the problem can be traced back to the system of slavery, the abolition of slavery, and the reaction and the subsequent historical steps that follow. First of all, though, let's start with an analysis of the economics behind the slave trade. All right? Important to this whole notion is the concept of the triangle of trade. And the way that the triangle of trade worked was a system that's called mercantilism. And mercantilism is the logic that set up the colonies in the United States and actually across the world to begin with. What Europe was looking to do when it colonized the world was it was looking to create a market for finished goods. And the way the colonial/mercantile system worked is that colonies would ship raw product back to the mother country. The mother country would then remanufacture the product and sell it at a profit after shipping it back to the colonies. Let's use an example here to better understand how this works. Let's look at sugarcane. Sugarcane is a crop that's grown in various parts of the United States as well as the Caribbean. What would happen is sugar would be grown on plantations. Sugar would be grown on plantations. This would be sent back to Europe, where it was then made into a finished product and sent back. You're looking at things like confections that were made out of sugar. Actually, this whole concept is what eventually led to the creation of chocolate as we know it today, the mixing of sugar and cocoa with milk. But it also, the biggest export that was sent back to the colonies, ironically, with sugar, was that of rum. Now, plantations were large agricultural ventures that took up a lot of land, and importantly, the whole process had not been mechanized. So there needed to be human labor to both plant the crops and to ensure that the crops were properly harvested. In order to create that pool of labor, stops were made in Africa by ships, where Africans were loaded on to be brought back to the United States to be sold as slaves. For plantation owners, slaves represented a major investment up front because of the purchase price the purchase price they had to pay for slaves. But after they were purchased, they provided a free labor pool that essentially was done at the cost of being fed and housed. And as a number of different pieces of literature that we're not going to cover in this course, but you'll probably cover more in either a history or sociology course, the conditions in which slaves lived were quite brutal. This worked rather well, even post-American Revolution, although at this point we were starting to see a movement to ban slavery in the North. Many would argue because it wasn't economically viable. But it continued in the South until the Civil War came along. Post-Civil War, and actually the post-short Reconstruction period afterwards, plantation owners found themselves in a bit of a bind. They had to grow their crops, but they couldn't afford to employ native labor at market rates. So what they did was they developed a system that was known as sharecropping. And what sharecropping was, at least in theory, and one of the reasons why it passed legal muster, is it created a way, is individuals were given plots of land, that they were given loans from the plantation owner to farm, and then at harvest season, they had to pay back those loans with interest. During periods prior to the harvest, individuals that were sharecropping land were given lines of credit that could only be used at the plantation store, many times stores that charged exorbitant prices for goods and services. In theory, this sounds like something that it would create an independent business environment, but what happened in reality is when the harvest was brought in, the amount of cash that the plantation owner was willing to pay for the harvest normally just about covered the debt and left very little money for the individuals that had cropped the land. In essence, it was slavery in another form. So African Americans living under this system realized that there was no way that they were going to be able to succeed. So what many African Americans did is they migrated north in search of the American dream. The North beckons, all right? The North was actually a perfect place to provide at least, again, what was in theory a nurturing environment for African Americans, because toward the end of the 1800s and the beginning of the 1900s, the United States was actually experiencing its own industrial revolution. Many immigrant groups had come to factories to serve as pools of labor, but there still wasn't enough help. And as various immigrant groups started to evolve, they worked themselves into the middle class in the American fabric, such that they really didn't want to work and do factory work, which the conditions at that time, which were actually quite brutal. However, the factories provided an avenue for individuals to be able to earn a living wage. All right. Also, northern cities, because they never, I won't say never adopted slavery, but had abolished slavery, had a more tolerant point of view toward African Americans, and as a result became the new promised land. That said, even though African Americans were able to have a living wage employment, this was far from a panacea. It's not the promised land that many people had envisioned. Fearing that African Americans would integrate into the community fabric like many Europeans had, and there still being a spirit of racism, despite the fact that slavery had been abolished, created a number of mechanisms that were legal that created something that's known as that I'm going to call de facto segregation. I want to go over a few of them, because what these mechanisms did is they created a way to confine African Americans to what we will call ghettos, without having to use the segregation measures that were politically unpopular in the South. All right? The first of these is something that's known as redlining. And what redlining did is it basically picked certain parts of the city, and it was actually done by the FHA, where the federal government would not insure mortgages for home ownership. All right? As we all know, the purchase of a home many times is the foundation to American prosperity. These neighborhoods, not ironically, and we're actually looking here at a redlining map from the city of Chicago, and you'll see how that this was set up. This map was actually from 1938. Set certain parts of the city, in this case a D district, which is shown in the dark color, a D district where banks were unwilling to lend. As a result of being unable to have a home mortgage, individuals were forced into a lifetime of rental property. One of the beauties of the concept of the American mortgage is that normally after 30 years the mortgage is paid off. As a result, you no longer have to pay rent, although indeed there are costs such as maintenance and insurance. When you don't have to pay rent, it makes life much easier in your older years, and the house actually becomes an asset. All right? African Americans, because their neighborhoods were denied access to this credit, were not able to participate. Now, one would say, why didn't African Americans just move to other neighborhoods? Really good question. Excellent question. And the reason why is there's a mechanism that's known as a restrictive covenant. And what a restrictive covenant is it's basically an addendum to a property deed that basically says what you can and cannot do when you sell the property. And that meow you're hearing, actually, by the way, is my cat, who is joining me as I create this lecture. But what a restrictive covenant did is it was a note onto a deed that said that you couldn't sell to certain classes of people. The two groups that were normally targeted by restrictive covenants were African Americans and Jewish Americans. As such, that even if an African American was able to get credit in a higher class neighborhood, outside of the red-lined areas that essentially became ghettos, they were unable to buy because there was a restrictive covenant on the transfer of the deed. And again, the deed could not be transferred even by a second owner or a third owner. It stayed in perpetuity to the owner of the house. Made it very, very hard for African Americans that were upper middle class and African American professionals such as doctors and lawyers to be able to move into other neighborhoods. Another mechanism was zoning. All right? Now, many of you think of zoning and you go, how in the world can this do anything? Actually, if you look at your municipality zoning codes, you're going to find that actually it's a bunch of gibberish that doesn't make sense to folks except developers and planning lawyers. But zoning dictates how a part of the city can be built. Now, if you're trying to keep out low-income people, there are mechanisms that zoning will let you do that. The normal is some sort of minimum lot size and a restriction on the type of housing, so that individuals that can't afford to buy a larger piece of land or are unable to afford the type of housing that's dictated are unable to live in those areas. It effectively keeps people out. It also creates a mechanism that assures that low-income housing, or housing that's designed for low-income people, which is normally either apartments or buildings that hold more than one family, are unable to be built in these areas. This is something in the concept of zoning that's known as multifamily housing. Zoning can prohibit multifamily housing, which basically limits an area to single family homes. All right? Now, we all talked about lack of mortgages and how that can impact a community, but following redlining, there was also a lack of credit issuance by banks to area businesses, which limited the ability of African Americans that were business owners to expand their businesses outside of their neighborhoods. When expanding a business, it takes money. And many businesses that have one small successful shop are unable to expand without some help from the bank. Because it costs a lot of money to get a business set up, and it often takes, normally the estimate is about 3 years, for once a storefront is set up for that storefront to actually turn a profit that enables the store owner to actually take money home. Without money to be able to do that, it becomes very hard for businesses to expand. Also, financing mechanisms that may have been provided, for example, a business that's selling something has to be able to get inventory in the door, and many times there's not money, particularly at the beginning of a season, let's say Christmas or back to school season, for business owners to be able to buy these goods. So a very common mechanism that's used by many businesses is that they'll borrow from a bank to purchase their inventory and then later resell it. And then pay the loan back at the end. While there were internal networks that enabled that enabled businesses inside neighborhoods, normally lenders that primarily specialized in lending to neighborhoods that didn't have the force actually of a big bank, allowed storefronts to be able to finance the inventory in. These mechanisms were not available, as you would see from a much bigger bank, for large-scale expansions, basically limiting the mobility of people that were business owners in these neighborhoods. The final mechanism that was used when African Americans started trying to move out of cities was something that was known as blockbusting. And what would the way that this would work is that an unscrupulous realtor would come into a neighborhood once an African American family had somehow managed to move in, and tell the people that lived in that particular area that because of the presence of an African American family, their home values were going to plummet. Due to concerns regarding racism, many people that lived in these neighborhoods sold their homes, often at a loss, and then what the realtor would do is then sell these homes at a profit to African Americans that moved into these areas. While mechanisms such as these served to segregate African Americans into specific neighborhoods, what they did do is they created a very vibrant neighborhood within these communities, all right, such that you had a mixed class of professionals. You had doctors and lawyers living in the same neighborhood that you had factory workers. And as such, these communities, even without the lack of traditional forms of credit, managed to become very self-sustaining, and they managed to become economically viable. That said, this is definitely not the freedom that was envisioned post-Civil War and during the Reconstruction, and what people had in mind when the Emancipation Proclamation was issued. That said, it did provide a mechanism for African Americans, even if they had very little education, to have a living wage and to be able to support themselves and their families. Very big role here for factories. This system all but collapsed in the 1960s as part of the Civil Rights Movement. We actually see Lyndon Johnson signing the Civil Rights Act, and at that point, racism in the United States effectively became illegal. While racism was illegal, this did not prove to be the saving grace that many living in African American neighborhoods had expected. Ironically, the civil rights reforms occurred at the same time that there were two very big forces that were going on to impact factory work in the inner cities. All right? The first of these was globalization. Many businesses realized that wages in the United States were much higher than wages that were being paid overseas, and that it was much cheaper to build a factory in a place in Asia and ship the goods back to the United States than it was to actually build the goods here. So what we see is the start of factories going overseas. And the first factories that went overseas were those that were located in the inner cities. As a result, the mechanism that had been used by many immigrant groups and by many African Americans to assure that they had a middle-class lifestyle, or at least a lifestyle that enabled them to support their families, gradually ceased to exist. And secondly, we see suburbanization occurring. While this was a trend that actually started post-World War II, when veterans were returning home, in the 60s and the 70s, we see this force going in droves, such that individuals preferred to live in the suburbs, and as we see growing population in the suburbs, and that land is cheaper in the suburbs than it is in the inner cities, we see many factories that had stayed in the inner cities moving out to the suburbs to take advantage of the new labor pool that was being created out there, and more importantly, to take advantage of cheaper land. As such, the avenue that many poorly educated African Americans had relied on to support themselves became very difficult to obtain. And the only things that were left were things like service work, those that did not have quality educations were things like service works. At the same time, by the way, we see this also being paired. Well, we'll talk about that a little bit more in the next slide. All right. We find that with the inability for primary breadwinners in a family to be able to earn a living wage, we see these neighborhoods starting to decline. And as neighborhoods started to decline, those that could afford to get the hell out of Dodge actually did. We see middle class and upper middle class African Americans moving out to the suburbs, such that the only people that remained in these neighborhoods were those that traditionally had relied on factory work and were no longer able to get it. All right? So basically, as I say on the slide, those left are those that had the fewest resources. Now, this actually creates a perpetuating cycle, because when individuals have very few resources, and you don't have people earning, at least a great deal of people earning high incomes, that affects the tax base of a city. And the tax base of a city is very important because this funds two very important things that are vital to city residents. The first of these are city services, such as paving streets. If we were in the, well, I am going to say it's snow removal, but things like flood control and trimming of trees and the like. Funding for these services was cut severely. However, the biggest area where we start seeing funding cuts are inner city schools. And as we see people starting to move out, we see inner city schools lagging more and more and more behind their suburban peers. Now, with the lack of factory work, all right, with the lack of factory work and the economy shifting to what we call today the knowledge-based economy, this created a scenario that made it very, very hard for even those that wanted to get out of the ghetto, and most people do, by the way, for those that want to get out of the ghetto to do so, because they don't have the skills and education that are necessary to survive in today's knowledge-based labor market. And as I say, creates what Wilson will term as a perpetual cycle of poverty. Now, with this migration to the ghettos, we start to see the social fabric unravel. With people leaving, with those that were upper-class professionals and middle-class professionals moving out to the suburbs, we see a decline in social capital. Now, what do I mean here when I talk about social capital? Social capital is the ability to do things such as networking and being around individuals that can help you succeed, all right? And one thing that is really vital to this is the role of role models, okay? Role models give us people that we aspire to. And with those that had succeeded in the world of business and succeeded in other endeavors, moving out, we start to see a lack of the role models, of these role models in inner city neighborhoods. This is a chronic problem today as well, especially for African American males, because we see the criminal justice system cycling many African American males in and out of neighborhoods, not creating stable support structures. In many neighborhoods, the source of role models has actually become African American churches that have decided to stay in these neighborhoods. When you're unable to earn a living wage, you still need to survive. As such, government assistance becomes a way of life. As we start to see, especially the minimum wage decline in proportion to the general inflation rate, we see more and more families relying on government assistance. Wilson will argue that these factors coming together has created an environment that in today's inner city impoverished neighborhoods, people feel hopeless. Now, this is where drawing from this as his foundation, Wilson probably makes the most controversial argument in the book. And that is that crime, and the crime that we see in inner city neighborhoods, is many times a function of a lack of economic opportunity and for people being able to work their way out of these impoverished environments and have a living wage. All right? The fact is that money has to be made somehow. The kids need shoes, there needs to be food on the table, and the food stamp allowance doesn't normally pay enough to support a family for a month. And there are emergencies that pop up, and people need emergency fundings that sometimes can be large. Let's say a member of a family passes away unexpectedly. That means thousands of dollars need to be raised to pay for a funeral. That money has to come from somewhere. Now, the first resource that people will normally use in a situation like this are friends and relatives, but many times, especially in impoverished neighborhoods, friends and relatives don't have the money to do that. So what do people do? People resort to mechanisms that enable them to earn money outside of the traditional labor system. This is something that we refer to as informal labor. Now, some informal labor, while being illegal, is relatively benign. Think of somebody cutting hair in their house or somebody providing babysitting services. However, there are times that people are forced to enter the illegal realm. All right? Primary examples of this are crimes of drug dealing and prostitution. I don't want to get into prostitution a lot right now because we're going to see with Lisa Mayer's book that you're going to have an opportunity to read later in this course. But let's talk about something like drug dealing. Research tells us that most drug dealing is not a full-time endeavor. Most people that do drug dealing are folks that have other jobs that are doing this as a way to supplement their income. Now think for a second. Drug dealing carries a very large risk. Would most people logically accept the risk of incarceration, which is a very high cost, everyone admits, if they were able to earn money elsewhere? Interesting question. Wilson says, and we actually see from the quotes in the chapter, that Wilson says no, that most people that get into drug dealing, and he actually, are people that are doing this because they have no other way to make money. Now keep in mind, for folks that just have a high school diploma, or in many cases less than a high school diploma, because dropout rates in these areas are very high, you're looking at, in a city, particularly jobs that have access to public transit because people can't afford to buy cars, we see that these are jobs that are paying minimum wage. And minimum wage is not enough for a family, particularly a family that has to pay very high rent in inner cities, to be able to support themselves. All right? Wilson will also not explicitly argue, but the fact that we've seen government support go down for programs such as housing and child care assistance, because we've seen the support go down by so much, that people have been forced into a life of crime to pay for the basics of life. Now, I will admit, this is indeed a very controversial argument. All right? So, I want to answer right now, and this isn't part of Wilson, this is something I've added to the lecture, is how does this create a system like Ferguson? And I'm going to use Ferguson because Ferguson is the one, it's a city that I've done some of my own research in, and it's a city that has had probably the most activity since we've seen the riots that occurred a few years ago. All right? What we see in Ferguson is a city that's struggling because its tax base has gone down significantly with poorer residents. All right? And as a result, the city struggled very hard to be able to provide basic services to its residents. and as such came up with a second source of revenue beyond property taxes, because the residents that owned homes simply refused to vote them in to pay for services for what they viewed as an invasion from downtown St. Louis of African Americans that have been forced out of the city by something known as gentrification. Ferguson, by the way, is a very close suburb of St. Louis. It's actually located right by the airport. So the city came up with a different mechanism to be able to pay for things. And the mechanism that it chose were traffic violations. All right? And basically, it's the notion of tickets and fines as a revenue generating strategy. All right? Now, I hope none of you have ever gotten a traffic ticket or a parking ticket. I really do. However, what happens if you don't pay a parking or a traffic ticket? Does it go away? Absolutely not. Instead, the fines increase. And eventually, if you don't pay a parking or a traffic ticket, a warrant is issued for your arrest. And more importantly, they suspend your driver's license if you own a car. So it makes it hard to legally get from point A to point B. All right? Now, when you have a low-income neighborhood that has a high crime level, as is the case in the African-American, in the low-income neighborhood in Ferguson, which by and large I can say is really about 99% African-American, where are you going to concentrate the police? You're going to concentrate the police where the crime is highest. So who are the people that are most likely to get stopped for traffic violations when the city is using traffic violations as a major supplementary source of revenue? It's the people in these neighborhoods. So we see people getting these the folks that are getting a majority of the traffic fines that the city is using to supplement its budget are those that can least afford to pay them. And many times, residents would argue that some of these traffic violations were a little fuzzy and a little shaky because officers were expected, although the Ferguson Police Department denies it, were expected to issue a certain number of traffic violations. Not a quota system per se, but really very close. All right? So we see, imagine that you're in a neighborhood and you're seeing your friends, your family, and your neighbors getting arrested because they can't pay traffic violations and end up in jail. Once in jail, they end up with costs, they end up with court costs and fines because they couldn't pay their tickets. All right? What that does is it creates a cycle where everyone's going to jail. And I mean, I'm using that as an exaggeration, but you see a lot of folks going to jail. And when that person going to jail is a father, when that person going to jail is a mother or a grandmother, it breaks up families. Or for that matter, a parent seeing their child end up incarcerated because they did stupid things when they first got their driver's license is also very heartbreaking. So what happened is that people in these neighborhoods don't trust the police. All right? Instead of police being the friend, police are viewed as the enemy. They're being viewed as the people that are writing all of these tickets. Some of them, again, really are. Even the United States Department of Justice says that they're a little bogus, more than a little bogus. And we see because people can't pay them, they're incarcerated. All right? And perceptions of police matter. All right? Because what happened when Michael Brown was murdered is there was a situation where there was no video, and the people of Ferguson had to give the police the benefit of the doubt. All right? Now, if you don't trust the police and the police act for the benefit of the doubt, that's not going to work. And the attitude from the people of Ferguson was this, is first, you start giving us tickets, then you start sending us to jail, and now you're killing us. All right? Now, mind you, you can disagree with the logic that goes into this, and this is a very controversial notion, but that's what led people to protest. And actually, the Ferguson protest got out of hand because once the citizens of Ferguson started to protest, it was followed by people that were facing similar frustrations in the surrounding area. and eventually you have the activities that grew into what would become known as the Ferguson riots. But that is why we see this. We see the whole thing in Ferguson that became as bad as it did. All right, this is probably not the most positive lecture I'm going to give, but trust me, as you get through, we have solutions for all of this, and we're going to see how things change and get better. I thank you very much for listening to Lecture 1, and have a great rest of your day. Take care.